This text is important because it contains so many relevant traits. Under the sign of the monstrous, the author unites the marks that identify a victim and the stereotypical crimes without mixing them. Something here seems to resist conflating the two rubrics. There's an actual, though not justified, separation. Physical and moral monstrosity go together in mythology. Their connection seems normal and is even suggested by language. But in a similar situation in our historical universe, we would not exclude the possibility of the victims being real, making the perpetual juxtaposition of the two kinds of monstrosity odious. We would suspect that its origin lay in the mentality of persecution. But what else could be its source? What other force might always be responsible for converging the two themes? For reassurance, it is attributed to the imagination. We always rely on the imagination in order to avoid reality. Yet I'm not referring to the imagination of the esthetician, but rather to that of Guillaume de Machat's, at its most confused, to the sort of imagination which, precisely because it is confused, brings us back to the real victims. It is always the imagination of the persecutors. Physical and moral monstrosity are heaped together in myths that justify the persecution of the infirm. The fact that other stereotypes of persecution surround them leaves no room for doubt. If this were a rare conjunction, it might be dubious, but innumerable examples can be found. It is the daily fare of mythology. Except in the case of certain exemplary myths, that of Oedipus in particular, mythology cannot be directly assimilated to the pattern of representations of persecution that can be decoded. But it can be so indirectly. Instead of bearing certain faintly monstrous characteristics, the victim is hard to recognize as a victim because he is totally monstrous. This difference should not lead us to decide that the two types of texts cannot have a common source. After detailed examination, it becomes clear that we are dealing with a single principle of distorted presentation, though in mythology the mechanism operates in a higher registry than in history. It is undeniably and universally true that the less rational the persecutor's conviction, the more formidable that conviction becomes. But in historical persecutions, the conviction is not so overwhelming as to conceal its character in the process of accusation from which it stems. Admittedly, the victim is condemned in advance. He cannot defend himself. His trial has already taken place, but at least there is a trial, no matter how prejudiced. The witches are hunted legally. Even the persecuted Jews are explicitly charged with crimes that are less unlikely than those of the mythical heroes. The desire for relative probability, which conjures up the poisoning of rivers, paradoxically helps us to make the distinction between truth and falsity. Mythology demands the same operation, though in a more daring form because the circumstances are more confused. In historical persecutions, the guilty remain sufficiently distinct from their crimes for there to be no mistake about the nature of the process. The same cannot be said of myth. The guilty person is so much a part of his offense that one is indistinguishable from the other. The guilty person is so much a part of his offense that one is indistinguishable from the other. His offense seems to be a fantastic essence or ontological attribute. In many myths, the wretched person's presence is enough to contaminate everything around him, infecting men and beasts with the plague, ruining crops, poisoning food, causing game to disappear, and sowing discord around him. Everything shrivels under his feet and the grass does not grow again. He produces disasters as easily as a fig tree produces figs. He need only be himself. The definition of victim as sinner or criminal is so absolute in myth, and the causal relationship between crime and collective crisis is so strong that even perceptive scholars have as yet failed to disassociate these details and to identify the accusatory process. The persecution text, whether medieval or modern, provides the needed Ariadne's thread. Even those historical texts that retain the strongest sense of persecution reflect only very slight conviction. The more relentlessly they struggle to demonstrate the justice of their wrongdoing, the less convincing they sound. If the myth were to state undoubtedly Oedipus killed his father, it is certain that he had intercourse with his mother, we would recognize the type of lie it embodies. It would be written in the style of historical persecutors from a basis of belief. But it speaks But it speaks tranquilly of an unquestionable fact. Oedipus killed his father, he had intercourse with his mother. In the same tone, one would say night follows day or the sun rises in the east. The distortions in persecution become weaker as we move from myths to persecutions in the Western world. This weakening has in fact allowed us to decipher the latter. Our task is to use this decoding in order to gain access to mythology. I will use as my guide the text of Guillaume de Mauchat and the others we have already encountered because they are easier to read, to help interpret the myth of Oedipus first of all, and then increasingly more difficult texts. As we proceed, we will recognize all the stereotypes of persecution and so reach the conclusion that there are real acts of violence and real victims behind themes that seem so fantastic that it is difficult to think that one day we may no longer consider them purely and simply imaginary. Our medieval ancestors took the most incredible fables seriously. The poisoning of fountains by the Jews or by lepers, ritual infanticide, witches' broomsticks, and moonlight diabolical orgies. The mixture of cruelty and credulity seems insurpassable to us. And yet myths surpass them. Historical persecutions are the result of degraded superstitions. We think we are free of mythical illusions because we have sworn not to be hoodwinked by them. We are in the habit of considering necessarily fictional even the most plausible characteristics of mythological heroes because of their association with other improbable characteristics. Similarly, if we were to permit it, the same false notion of prudence and the same attitude toward fiction would prevent us from recognizing the reality of the anti-Semitic massacres in Guillaume de Mauchat. We do not doubt the reality of the massacres on the excuse that they are juxtaposed with all sorts of more or less significant fables. There is equally no good reason to doubt the reality in the case of myths. The face of the victim shows through the mask in the texts of historical persecutions. There are chinks and cracks. In mythology, the mask is still intact. It covers the whole face so well that we have no idea it is a mask. We think there is no one behind it, neither victim nor persecutor. We are somewhat like Polyphemus' brothers, the Cyclopes, to whom he calls in vain for help after Ulysses and his companions blinded him. We save our only eye if we have one for what we call history. As for our ears, if we have them, they only hear this no one, that is so deeply embedded in collective violence that we take it for nothing. Non-existent, pure fabrication by Polyphemus in a vein of poetic improvisation. We no longer consider mythological monsters as a supernatural or even natural species. There are no longer theological or even zoological genres. They belong instead to the quasi-genres of the imaginary archetypes of fable, heaped in an unconsciousness that is even more mythical than the myths themselves. There was a time when no one could read even the distortions of persecution found in our own history. Finally, we did learn. We can put a date to this achievement. It goes back to the beginning of the modern era and seems to constitute only the first stage in a process that has never really been interpreted but has been marking time for centuries because it lacked a truly fruitful direction that would stretch back to mythology. Now we must discuss an essential dimension of myth that is almost entirely absent from historical persecutions, that of the sacred. Medieval and modern persecutors do not worship their victims, they only hate them. They are therefore easy to identify as victims. It is more difficult to spot the victim in a supernatural being who is a cult object. Admittedly, the glorious adventures of the hero can hardly be distinguished from the stereotypical crimes of collective victims. Like those victims, moreover, the hero is hunted and even assassinated by his own people. But the experts are in agreement that such annoying incidents are not important. They are merely minor escapades in a career that is so noble and transcendental it is poor taste to notice them. Myths exude the sacred and do not seem comparable with texts that do not. No matter how striking the similarities mentioned in the preceding pages, they pale before this dissimilarity. I am trying to explain myths by discovering in them more extreme distortions of persecution than those of historical persecutors as they recall their own persecutions. The method has been successful until now since I have uncovered in myths the warped forms of everything that appears equally in persecution texts. We may wonder whether we are missing the essential. Even if on a lower level mythology is vulnerable to my comparative method, idealists will say that at a higher level it escapes through the transcendental dimension that is beyond reach. This is not so for the following two reasons, beginning with the similarities and differences between our two types of texts. The nature of the sacred and the necessity of its presence in myths can literally be deduced by a simple process of reasoning. I will go back to the persecution texts and show that, despite appearances, they contain traces of the sacred that correspond exactly to what is to be expected. If we were to recognize, as I did earlier, the degenerated and half-decomposed myths in these texts,